I'll give you a bit of bad news and a bit of good news. And this is just me kind of, again, looking at the mosaic and kind of judging where we are today. The bad news is I think that it's going to be a really tough, sticky time for the US consumer, probably over the next 18 months. And so I tend to think that, through the course of this year and through 2023 and possibly even a little bit of 24, it's going to be a grind. Unemployment will go back up. Inflation will be sticky. Real earnings will shrink. Consumption will ebb. And earnings will not be that great. But the silver lining is I think that we are starting a bottoming process for the equity markets. And I think that by the end of this year or the early part of next year, most of that will be done. And the reason is that, the equity markets, I think, do a reasonable job of one, looking at the bond market, and then two, looking 6 to 9 months into the future and pricing in that future today. And so by the end of this year, beginning of next year, I think that we will have kind of bottomed and we'll start to build a base. The thing to remind us, though, is that, let's just say a stock goes down 50%. Even if it rallies 50% from there, it's still 25% off from where it was.
Yeah, people don't understand that.
And people don't understand
hard it is
that.
To climb back up the mountain.
So I would just think, we're going to feel this for a while. It's this inflation, as I've said for a long time, is going to be sticky and persistent. I think you're going to see Fed funds at or breaching 5%. And but I think that in terms of risk assets will bottom out by the end of this year, beginning of next year. This is a super volatile, ugly point in the market. This last year has been really problematic. And Nick, maybe you can play the clip because I really want to make sure that it's very clear and on the record what I said almost an entire year ago. Let me put crypto in the context of the markets and where we are today at the end of the week. After, Q3 earnings in November of 2021, we have the stock market at absolute all-time highs.
Ripping.
We have crypto at absolute all-time highs.
Ripping.
We have the art markets. I don't know if you guys saw Phillips and Christie's and Sotheby's this past week at absolute all-time highs.
Sold another Beeple for $25 million.
We have inflation at a 30-year high. We have 10-year break-evens at a 25-year high. We have, some odd $1 trillion that we just approved last week, and we're still horse trading on another $1.8 trillion of stimulus that we're going to put in. And I think the most important thing, which is the two most important founders of our generation, the two smartest people who have really consistently won, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, have collectively sold more than $11 billion of their holdings this year alone. And if you can't take all of that and decide for yourself what's right for you and your family, you're doing yourself a disservice. I think it's important for me to never sort of be forced to tell folks whether I'm buying or selling, although I'm willing to do it in moments where I think it's important. But I think it's really important to understand the context. And so I think these folks that think derisively about individuals who are managing risk, I think it's really naive, and I think it creates a lot of missed opportunity for them as well. If the smartest people in the world are now selling their core holdings that they told you they would never sell, and you are not reconsidering your position on things, you're either much smarter than them or you're being really, really reckless. The reason I said all of those things was because I was getting really worried about where we were. And then I think on the heels of that, I published a tweet and I said, I'm starting to sell, and I sold $100 million of SoFi, but then I was a systematic seller through the end of last year and through this year to try to manage my own liquidity because it changed profoundly as I saw what was happening in the markets. So, I think that it's just an important thing to call out that things don't always go up, and you have to pay attention to a mosaic of information, and you have to do the work yourself because, your situation is unique to you. Nobody else understands it. And so you can't outsource that decision to somebody else. Obviously, you can use it as a guide. It's fair to say, when the 13 Fs of important hedge funds come out, do I read them? Of course, because I'm trying to figure out, what don't I know? What may I be missing? Maybe there's a great company in there that I should be taking a look at. So, I'm not dissimilar to everybody else in that I use other people that I look up to or respect as a leading indicator of what to buy. But I still take responsibility for my own decisions, and I manage my liquidity as best as I can based on my conditions. And those are always changing. And so I think this is just a good reminder that everybody else has to do the same.
If you look historically, the US has often been in the middle of or at the tail end of some either recessionary cycle or inflationary cycle when conflict escalated externally.
Wag the dog you're referring to?
I don't know if I would call it that, but I think that there is an innate human anxiety. When things aren't going well, you feel like you have to do something about it. And you're either going to have internal conflict or external conflict as a result to try and resolve. When things are going great, the economy is booming, you don't enter a war. You don't start a conflict with a nation when people are happy at home, when your constituents and the unemployment rate is low and wage growth is high, the economy is growing.
Are you referring to the United States or Russia in this case?
I'm referring to the U.S. And I think,
I know. I was just curious if you would.
Coming out of COVID and coming out of the big question marks that loomed over our economy at the end of last year around inflation, economic growth, interest rates, and the effect. And now we're in the middle of the turmoil. Markets are down 30%, and in some cases 70 to 80% for high growth markets. There's an inevitability now that unemployment is going to rise. There is an inevitability now that the economy is going to contract. Leadership is more likely in that scenario to find an outlet, to find a place of conflict. And I don't think it's a conscious
explain
decision.
why in this theory. Explain why.
Wag the dog.
Understand the concept.
Is that what you're saying, Freeberg? Wag the dog?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a conscious decision. I don't think that it's like, hey, let's go start a war with Russia because the economy is bad. I think it's this anxiety, the economy is bad, and there's not a lot we can do about it. And over here, on the other hand, there's a problem and there's something we can do about it. And we can build strength and we can build integrity and we can build support and we can get people to get behind something together and we can get something to create a driving mechanism to achieve something big.
Like a distraction, you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that psychology is as simple as a distraction or a wag the dog or, hey, it's not even as simple as the military-industrial complex will see revenue growth and wage growth and that'll drive the economy. But I think all those things together are true. And I think in whole, we are more likely to want to pursue conflict right now than we were even a year ago.
You buy into that, Chamath?
I think he's more right than wrong. I think that when things aren't easy, you need to find sort of distractions essentially to get people to focus on other things so that the core problem isn't as obvious. We have in the United States, I think.
Yeah, let's go create another problem that's solvable.
Yeah, like I think the best way that I can describe this is I see it as institutional rot. And the more that we're left to our own devices, that amount of institutional decay becomes more and more obvious. Our governments don't work the way that they should. Our state assemblies are basically co-opted by special interests. The federal institutions we rely on to make rules are not that great. Enormous amounts of money get wasted every day. And as more and more people become aware of these things, the trend is just so bad. Civic engagement goes down. Everything just gets worse. And so when you take that, and then on top of that, you sit it on a poor economy, that is a real powder keg, I think. And so folks I think if you're a politician, it's easier to kind of go and point to Taiwan and say, we're going to go and defend these folks if there's a war, point to Russia and say this, point to all these other things. Whether it's implicit, as Freeberg says, or it's more explicit of a strategy, I don't know. But the underlying cause is the same, which is that if the foundation of the house is not strong and you're not sure what to do to fix it, or you don't have the courage to fix it, the better strategic alternative is to distract and talk about your neighbor's house.
In order to resolve ultimately the inflation problem, you're going to have to see a significant increment in unemployment. And so when you raise interest rates, generally purchasing goes down, demand goes down, revenue goes down, layoffs happen, some businesses go bankrupt, etc. So then there's this trickle in the economy of less people being employed. And when that happens, it ultimately drives a political response, which is, hey, we're losing our jobs. People start asking their representatives, do something about this in Congress. And then these programs and these things get passed, which themselves are inflationary. And that's why it's very hard to predict ultimately when and how this all gets resolved, because we seem to have an administration that is enacting and embracing inflationary policies to support what they consider to be economic growth and improved employment conditions in this country. And the unfortunate effect of many of those policies is inflation. And then it forces this difficult central bank decision-making cycle. And so there's a tension right now that doesn't seem to have a clear path to resolution. That is why it's very hard to have a clear prediction here. We also have a very significant question overhanging all of these markets related to the price of energy, which is a key input to so many industries and drives cost, as well as food, and also the military conflict in Eastern Europe. And and then there's in the financial markets this big overhang question on what's going to happen with various countries that may default on on their debt, as well as China's real estate bubble bursting. But there's no easy answer that I can just say deterministically, here's my prediction of what's going to happen. As Chamath uses the term, I think it's a great term. There's this mosaic of things that are under consideration right now, and there's a tension between them all. That's kind of how I think about it.
There's a lot of geopolitical risk. Yeah. I mean, we're kind of ignoring what happened this week, where Putin basically is putting nukes back on the table. Now, I'm not saying that's likely to happen, but I don't know how this market gets a lot better with the risk of World War III hanging over our heads. I mean, who wants to enter the market with that on the table?
And by the way, the nukes, just to be clear, you can hear certain military commanders speaking publicly about this, but in the Russian military playbooks, there is specifically defined actions that can lead to tactical nuclear weapon use in the field. There's no direct indication that these things are going to be used right away, but as Sachs says, there's like this weird turning up the volume happening on, hey, maybe we're getting closer to a point where if Putin is having tactical failure in this conflict, there's more weaponry he can use that has greater impact. And unfortunately, there are these tactical nukes in his arsenal. And, a guy that maybe has a certain psychology that has, as our friends have said, his back against the wall, he's not a person who in his career or in his history has ever acquiesced to defeat.
Alex Karp was on CNBC. He was really, really sharp and concise about this, which is that, in the West, when leaders fail in their objectives, they just get elected out and somebody else takes their place.
Yeah.
But for somebody like Putin, there is nobody to take his place because it's a very zero-sum situation. And so his actions will, as a result, also be zero-sum. And I think folks...
He's never acquiesced in his life. And
yeah, we've never really we don't understand well what zero-sum decision-making looks like when it comes to stuff like this.
He needs the golden bridge, right? You need to give him the golden bridge out.
I'll just say two things. One is that I think it's been made pretty clear that both India and China will not stand beside Russia if they do something like this. And I think that is important because they still are the two biggest purchasers of Russian oil. And so I think that matters a lot because you're talking about a lot of revenue that would go away. And then the second is, I mentioned this last week, and this may sound dumb to some of you, but don't sleep on the Russian mothers. And what happened this week...
Oh, you're 100% right on that.
Well, what happened this week was really interesting, which is that he calls up all these reservists. These reservists are now coming from the major cities of Russia. You're starting to see protests. You're starting to see young people saying, I don't want to do this.
Yep.
And who's that really activating? It's activating the moms.
Yep.
And so don't sleep on the Russian moms.
300 people are being drafted, to basically go fight. And I actually think...
But David's right. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The question I have for you is, do you think, I know you don't agree with this, but do you think the strategy is to back him into a corner and then have this rhetoric spike to then force a resolution? I know it's a dangerous strategy. It's a crazy chess move. But do you think that's actually what the West is thinking?
I see no evidence that we have any intentions of seeking a diplomatic off-ramp. I see no evidence that they're looking to give him a golden bridge, like you said.
Then do you think they're trying to break him and have regime change?
I think Biden stated the policy, which is this man cannot remain in power. I think he blurted out the truth of his policy. This is a regime change policy. That's what they're going for. They are backing him into a corner.
Jacob, I thought that you were right this whole time, which is we're going to build a golden bridge. We're going to find a way to egress this guy. And I'm now sort of in the David camp, which is I think that the stated strategy of the Western alliance is essentially to cause him to make such a categorically catastrophic mistake so as to become a pariah, so as to either get overthrown or something. So I do think that on balance, the risk is now for things to escalate, maybe not in quantity, and I'll use this word in the wrong way, but quote unquote, like the intensity of it. So I think David's right. It's a lot of pressure to the economy and to risk assets.
High risk strategy.
It is a high risk strategy. We got a good thing going over here. I don't see the need for all this risk. So look, and part of the
risk would be the reward. What would you see the reward if Putin was removed? Oh my Lord.
Well, it depends who replaces him. What if we get a hardliner? You got to remember, Putin's taken out all the liberal reformers. All that's left are hardliners.
They're all in jail.
So I know there's moms protesting in the streets, but he's also under intense pressure from his right wing. He's got hawks on his side who basically have been criticizing him for making this a special limited military operation instead of a war. They're like, why did you try to do this with 200,000 troops? We should have gone in heavy with 1 million.
Oh, is that right? There's criticism internally of him.
There's a New York Times article about this. He has his own, military hardliners in his security state.
His hawks.
So So he's not just under pressure from peaceniks who are protesting in the streets. He's also under pressure from hardliners in his own government who think he's been too soft.
Yeah, it's a challenging situation. He's going to be 70 years old. How many years does he have left? We just need to contain him for a decade.
Time was on our side.
Contain him for more decade. That's my best idea. Contain him for a decade.
The thing I have the most trouble with is if you look at the media portrayal of this. So I said last week when we had this successful counteroffensive that maybe we'll get what we want, which is Russian morale collapses and they just tuck their tail between their legs and go back to Moscow. Or maybe, the Russians really do see this war as existential for them. Putin sees it as existential for himself and he escalates. Well, what happened this week? We went up a rung on the escalatory ladder. Basically, Putin drew down 300,000 more troops and he's basically indicated his willingness to use tactical nukes. And he's basically said, I'm not bluffing. So now what is the reaction in the American press? He must be bluffing.
I mean,
that basically is the reaction. And look, I don't know how you know that. In poker, what do we do when someone we put them on a range. It's called a hand range, right?
Yes.
You can't possibly know exactly what they're going to do or what cards they're holding. So you put them on a range of possible hands and then you evaluate the story in light of their past actions. What do they do before the flop, on the flop? And you basically come to an assessment of what is likely based on their story. Now, take Putin's story. Like Freeberg said, he's never backed down in his life from anything. He has said this war is existential. He basically threatened to invade and so he did. I mean, I don't know how you can immediately jump to the conclusion this is just a bluff. Maybe it is, but
it could still be a bluff. But then, to your point, the range of outcomes does include shoving on the river, moving all in.
He could move all in. I mean, he's a KGB agent. Do you want to play poker with a KGB agent with nukes? It's
right. And so, Jason, you've said throughout this guy's a madman. Well, exactly. I mean, personally, I think he's more like a ruthless mafia boss than a madman. But let's say you're right that he is a madman. What is the story about what we're doing that makes sense if he is a madman? Why would we want to basically back him into a corner like that? Why wouldn't we give him the golden off-ramp? And by the way, just on this idea that no one would ever use tactical nukes, let me just give you 3 data points. First of all, we used them. We dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. We could have won that war without doing it, but we didn't want to lose the troops.
Well, no, wait, those weren't tactical nukes. Those were
They were tactical nuke-size atomic bombs. Number 2, MacArthur wanted to use 20 to 30 atomic bombs to end the Korean War. He had a whole plan. Truman fired him. He thought he basically had jumped the shark. But MacArthur was the most respected and admired American in 1950. And the reason why Truman could not run for re-election is because he fired MacArthur. MacArthur would have used basically the equivalent of tactical nukes to win the Korean War. And his plan to prevent China from re-invading from the north was to irradiate the border so completely that Chinese troops could not go through it.
Keep in mind, there wasn't as many nukes at the time, so we weren't up against 9 different nuclear-enabled countries. But yes,
I understand, but we had an American commander, a head of our military, who was willing to use nukes to win a war. So this idea that he wouldn't, I mean, we've been willing to do that. And the third example is obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of Kennedy's military advisors were willing to use nukes. I mean, and the best thing Kennedy did was not listen to his military advisors. They were all super hawkish. And Kennedy, what did he do? He looked for a way out. He looked for a compromise. He sent Bobby Kennedy to go cut a secret deal with the Russians where Kennedy agreed to pull our Jupiter missiles out of Turkey if the Russians would pull their missiles out of Cuba. And then he lied to the American public about it because he didn't want to be perceived as backing down. But that's the kind of, flexibility and mental acuity that I think you would need in a nuclear showdown to avoid a catastrophe. If things do escalate to the point of a nuclear showdown, do we believe that we have leadership on the level of a Jack Kennedy or a Bobby Kennedy who can basically show the flexibility and adaptability to cut a deal to basically pull us back from the brink?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that.
What was Biden's response? It was he gave this speech to the United Nations in response to Putin. And it's more of the same. It's more of this, as I call it, the Abe Simpson speech. This old man, yelling at the cloud. I mean, he's basically just yelling at a teleprompter. Now, I think the strategically smart play would have been to say, listen, Putin, you said that you want the people of Ukraine to decide where these territories go. Okay, we can hold a referendum, but we want it administered by the United Nations so it'll have some credibility behind it. I mean, why not throw that out there as a potential way to get diplomacy started?
It felt like at the end of last year, you guys remember I thought conflict was likely this year. I don't think that the conditions that I was referencing have really gotten better. I think they've gotten worse.